Belgariad, Upon a Prophecy by David Eddings. Prologue. Being a history of the War of the Gods and the acts of Belgarath the Sorcerer, adapted from the Book of Alaron. When the world was new, the 7 gods dwelt in harmony, and the races of men were as one people. Beliar, youngest of the oldest gods, was beloved by all the Elorians. He abode with them and cherished them, and they prospered in his care. The other gods also gathered peoples about them, and each god cherished his own people. But Beliar's eldest brother, Alder, was god over no people. He dwelt apart from men and gods until the day that a vagrant child sought him out. Alder accepted that child as his disciple and called him Belgoth. Belgoth learned the secret of the will and the word and became a sorcerer. In the years that followed, others also sought out the solitary god that he joined in a brotherhood to learn at the feet of Alder, and time did not touch them. Now, it happened that Alder took up a stone in the shape of a globe, no larger than the heart of a child, and he turned that stone into his hand until it became a living soul. This isn't go fuck to sleep. Hi, Nez. No. It isn't. But I think you'll like it. The power of the living jewel, which men called the Orb of Alder, was very great, and Alder worked wonders with it. Of all the gods, Torek was the most beautiful, and his people were the Agnocs. They burned sacrifices before him, calling them Lords of Lords. And Torek found the smell of sacrifice and the words of adoration sweet. The day came, however, when he heard of the Orb of Alder, and from that moment he knew no peace. Finally, in assembled guise, he went to Alder. "My brother," he said, "it is not fitting that thou shalt abstain thyself from our company and counsel. Put aside this jewel which hast thou seduced thy mind from our fellowship." Alder looked into his brother's soul and rebuked him. Why lost thou seek fucking hell, I forget. Why lost thou seek lordship and domain, Torek? Isn't Agnok enough for thee? Do not in thy pride seek to possess the orb, lest it slay thee. Great was Torek's shame at the words of Alder, and he raised his hand and smote his brother. Taking the jewel, he fled. The other gods besought Torek to return the orb, but he would not. Then the races of men rose up and came against the hosts of Agnok, and made war on them. The wars of the gods and the men raged into the land until, near the high place of Corum, Torek raised the orb and forced his will to join with his to split the earth asunder. The mountains were cast down, the sea came in, but Beliar and Alder joined their wills and set limits upon the sea. The races of men, however, were separated from the others, and the gods also. Now, when Torek raised the living orb against the earth, its mother, it awoke and began to glow with holy flame. The face of Torek was seared by the blue flame. In pain, he cast down the mountains. In anguish, he cracked open the earth. In agony, he let in the sea. His left hand flared and burned to ashes. The flesh on the left side of his face melted like wax, and his left eye boiled in its socket. With a great cry, he cast himself into the sea to quench the burning, but his anguish was without end. When Torek rose from the water, his right side was still fair, but his left side was burned and scarred hideously by the fire of the orb. An endless plain, he led his people away to the east, where they built a great city on the plains of Malrior, which they called Kalth Mashark, City of the Night, for Torek hid his maim in darkness. The Argonauts raised an iron tower for their god and placed the orb in an iron cask in the topmost chamber. Often Torek stood before the cask, then fled weeping, lest his yearning to look up on the orb overpower him and he perish utterly. The centuries rolled past in the lands of Agnok, and they came to call their maimed god Kaltorak both king and god. Beliar had taken the Alrons to the north. Of all men, they were the most hardy and warlike, and Beliar had put eternal hatred for Agnok in their hearts. With cruel swords and axes they raged the north, even in the lands of eternal ice, seeking a way to their ancient enemies. Thus, it was until the time when Shearsberg Shoulders, greatest king of the Alrons, traveled to the Vale of Aldor to seek out Belgarath. The sorcerer, "The way to the north is opened," he said. "The signs and the augurs are propitious. Now the time is ripe for us to discover the way to the city of night and regain the orb from One Eye." Poladaria, wife of Belgar, was great with child, and he was reluctant to leave her, but Shurik prevailed. They stole away one night to join Shurik's sons, Dara Spoolneck, Algar Fleetfoot, and Riva Irongrip. Cruel winter gripped the Northland, and the moors glittered beneath the stars with frost and steely gray ice. To seek their way out, Belgarath cast an enchantment and took the shape of a great wolf. On silent feet, he slunk through the snow-floored forest, where the trees cracked and shattered in the sundering cold. Grim frost silvered the ruffs and shoulders of the wolf, and even after the hair and beard of Belgarath were silver. Through snow and mist, they crossed into Meliar and came in at last to Koth Muskar. Finding a secret way into the city, Belgarath led them to the foot of the iron tower. Silently they climbed the rusted stairs, which had known no step for 20 centuries. Fearful they passed through the chamber where Torak tossed in pain-haunted slumber, his maimed face hidden beneath a steel mask. Stealthily they crept past the sleeping god in the smoldering darkness and came at last to the chamber where lay the iron cask in which rested the living orb. Shurik motioned for Belgarath to take the orb, but Belgarath refused. "I must not touch it," he said, "lest it destroy me. Once it welcomed the touch of man or god, but its will hardened when Torak raised it against its mother. It will not be so used again. It reads our souls. Only one without ill intent, who is pure enough to take it and convey it in peril of his life, without thought or of power or possession, may touch it now." "But man has no ill intent in the silence of his soul?" Shurik asked, but Riva Irongrip opened the casket and took the orb. Its fire shone through his fingers, but he was not burned. "So be it, Shurik," he said. "Your youngest son is pure. It shall be his doom, and the doom of all who follow him, to bear the orb and protect it." And Belgarath sighed, knowing the burden he had placed on Rivia. "Then his brothers and I will sustain him," Shurik said, "for so long as this doom is upon him." Riva muffled the orb in his cloak and hid it beneath his tunic. They crept again through the chambers of the maimed god, down the rusted stairs, along the secret way to the gates of the city, and into the wasteland beyond. Soon after, Torak awoke and went, as always, into the chamber of the orb, but the cask stood open, and the orb was gone. Horrible was the wrath of Kaltorak. Taking his great sword, he went down from the iron tower, and turned and smote it once, and the tower fell. To the Argonauts he cried out in a voice thundering, "Because you have become indolent and unwatchful, and let a thief steal that for which I paid so dear, I break your city and drive you forth. Argonaut shall wander the earth until Cath Yaksha, the burning stone, is returned to me." Then he cast down the city of the night in ruins, and drove the host of Argonaut into the wilderness. Koth-Mashak was no more. 3 leagues into the north, Belgarath heard the wailing from the city, and now Torak had awakened. Now he'll come for us, he said, and only the power of the orb can save us. When the hosts are upon us, iron grip, take the orb and hold it so they may see it. The hosts of Agonok came, and with Torek himself in the forefront, but Riva held forth the orb so that the maimed god and his hosts might behold it. The orb knew its enemy, its hatred flamed anew, and the sky became alight with its fury. Torek cried out and turned away. The front ranks of the Agnot host were consumed by fire, and the rest fled in terror. Thus Belgarath and his companions escaped from Melior, and passed again through the marches of the north, bearing the orb of Alder once more into the kingdom of the west. Now the gods, knowing all that had passed, held council in Alder and advised them, if we wage war again upon our brother Torek, our strife will destroy the world. Thus we must abstain ourselves from the world so that our brother may not find us. No longer in flesh, but in spirit only may we remain to guide and protect our people. For the world's sake, it must be so. In the day that we war again, the world will be unmade. The gods wept that they must depart, but Shaldon, the bull god of the Arons, asked, in our absence, shall not Torek have domain? Not so, Alder replied. So long as the orb remains in the line of Riva Irongrip, Torek shall not prevail. So it was with that the gods departed, and only Torek remained. But the knowledge that the orb is in the hand of Riva denied him domain, cankered his soul. Then Belgarath spoke with Cherrick and his sons. Here we must part, to guard the orb and to prepare again for the coming of Torek. Let's each turn aside as I have instructed and make preparations. We will, Belgarath, vowed Cherrick, bare shoulders. From this day, Alriar is no more, but the Alorons will deny dominion to Torek as long as one Aloron remains. Belgarath raised his face. Hear me, Torek one-eyed, he cried. The living orb is secure against thee, and thou shalt not prevail against it. In the day thou comest against us, I shall raise war against thee. I will maintain watch upon thee by day and by night, and will abide against thy coming, even to the end of days. In the wastelands of Melior, Torek heard the voice of Belgarath and smote about him in fury, for he knew that the living orb was forever beyond his reach. Then Cherrick embraced his sons and turned away to see them no more. Drals went to the north and dwelt in the lands drained by River Mern. He built a city, Baltork, and called his land Dranassian. He and his descendants stood outward the north, their marches, and denied them to the enemy. Algor went to the south with his people and found horses on the border plains drained by Alder River. The horses they tamed and learned to ride for the first time in the history of men, mounted warriors appeared. Their country they called Algeria, and they became nomads, following their herds. Cherrick returned sadly to Val Orion and renamed his kingdom Cherrick, for now he was alone and without his sons. Grimly he built tall ships of war to patrol the seas and deny them to the enemy. Upon the bearer of the orb, however, fell the burden of the longest journey. Taking his people, Rivia went to the west coast of Sindaria. There he built ships, and he and his people crossed into the Isles of the Wind. They built their ships and built a fortress and walled a city around it. The city they called Rivia, and the fortress in the hall of Rivian Keen. Then Beliar, guard of the Alrons, caused 2 iron stars to fall from the sky. Rivia took up the stars and forged a blade from one and a hilt from another, setting the orb upon it as a pommel stone. So large was the sword that none but Rivia could wield it. In the wastelands of Malior, Kaltork felt in his soul the forging of the sword, and he tasted fear for the first time. The sword was set against the black rock that stood at the back of Rivia's throne, with the orb at the highest point, and the sword joined to the rock, so that none but Rivia could remove it. The orb burned with cold fire when Rivia sat upon the throne. When he took down his sword and raised it, it became a great tongue of cold fire. The greatest wonders was the marking of Rivia's heir, and each generation, one child in the line of Rivia bore upon the palm of his right hand the mark of the orb. The child so marked was taken to the throne chamber. His hand was placed upon the orb so that it might know him. With each infant's touch, the orb waxed in brilliance, and the bond between the living orb and the line of Rivia became stronger with each joining. Another drink. After Belgariad had parted from his companions, he hastened to the Val of Alder, but there he found that Paldora, his wife, had borne 2 twin daughters, and then had died. In sorrow he named the elder Belgariad. Her hair was dark as the raven's wing. In the fashion of sorcerers, he stretched forth his hand to lay it upon her brow, and a single lock at her forehead turned frostwhite at his touch. Then he was troubled, for the white lock was the mark of the sorcerers, and Belgariad was the first female child to be marked so. His second daughter, fair-skinned and golden hair, was unmarked. He called her Beldrana, and he and her dark-haired sister loved her beyond all else, and contended with each other for her affection. Now, when Belgariad and Beldrana had reached their 16th year, the spirit of Alder came to Belgarath in a dream, saying, "My beloved disciple, I would join thy house with the house of the guardian of the orb. Choose therefore which thy daughters thou wilt give to the Librarian king to be his wife and the mother of his line. For in the lines lie the hope of the world, against which the dark power of Torok may not prevail." In the deep silence of his soul, Belgarath was tempted to choose Belgariad, but knowing the burden which lay upon the Librarian king, he sent Beldrana instead, and wept when she was gone. Belgariad wept also long and bitterly, knowing that her sister must fade and die. In time, however, they comforted each other and came at last to know each other. They joined their powers to keep watch over Torok, and some men say they still abide still, keeping their vigil through all the uncounted centuries. Hello, Kai. Part 1. Sadrina. Aww, the cats are giving each other affection. It's great. Chapter 1. The first thing the boy Garon remembered was the kitchen at Falder's farm. For the rest of his life, he had a special warm feeling for kitchens and those particular sounds and smells that seemed somehow to combine into a bustling seriousness that had to do with love, food, and comfort and security, and above all, home. No matter how high Garon rose in his life, he never forgot that all his memories began in that kitchen. The kitchen at Falder's farm was a large, low-beamed room filled with ovens and kettles and great spits that turned slowly in cavern-like arched fireplaces. There were long, heavy work tables where bread was kneaded into loaves, and chickens were cut up, and carrots and celery were diced with quick, crisp, rocking movements of long carved knives. When Garon was very small, he played under those tables, and soon learned to keep his fingers and toes out from under the feet of the kitchen helpers who worked around them. And sometimes in late afternoon, when he grew tired, he would lay in a corner and stare into one of the flickering fires that gleamed and reflected back from the 100 polished pots and knives and long-handled spoons that hung up from the pegs along the whitewashed walls, and all bemused, he would drift into sleep in perfect peace and harmony with all the world around him. The center of the kitchen and everything that happened there was Aunt Paul. She seemed somehow to be able to be everywhere at once. The finishing touches that plumped a goose in its roasting pan, or a deftly shaped a rising loaf, or garnished a smoking ham fresh from the oven was always hers. Though there were several others who worked in the kitchen, no loaf, stew, soup, roast, or vegetable even went out of it that had not been touched at least by once by Aunt Paul. She knew by smell, taste, or some higher instinct which dish required, and she seasoned them all by pinch or trace, or a negligent seam shaking from an earth wind spice pot. It was as if there was kind of a magic about her, a knowledge and power beyond that of ordinary people. And yet, even at her busiest, she always knew precisely where Garion was, in the midst of crimping a pie crust or decorating a special cake, or stitching up a freshly stuffed chicken. She could, without looking, reach out for a leg and hook him back from under the feet of others with a heel or ankle. As he grew a bit older, it even became a game. Garen would watch until she seemed far too busy to notice him, and then laughing, he would run on his sturdy little legs towards a door, but she would always catch him, and he would laugh and throw his arms around her neck, kiss her, and then go back to watching for his next chance to run away. He was quite convinced in those early years that his Aunt Paul was quite the most important and beautiful woman in the world. For one thing, she was taller than any other woman on Falder's farm, barely nearly as tall as the man, and her face was always serious, even stern, except with him. Of course, her hair was long and very dark, almost black, but one lock just above her left brow, which was as white as new snow. At night, when she tucked him into the little bed close beside her own in their private room above the kitchen, he would reach out and touch the white lock, and she would smile at him and touch his face with a soft hand. Then he would sleep, content in the knowledge that she was there, watching over him. Faldor's farm lay very nearly in the center of Sidernia, a misty kingdom bordered on the west by the Sea of the Winds, and on the east by the Gulf of Shirik. Like all farmhouses in that particular time and place, Faldor's farmstead was not one building or two, but rather a solidly constructed complex of sheds, barns, and hen roosts and dove cotes, all facing inward upon a central yard with a stout gate at the front. Along the second-story gallery were the rooms, some spacious, some quite tiny, in which lived the farmhands who tilled and planted and weeded the extensive field behind the walls. Baldur himself lived in the quarters in the square tower above the central dining hall, where his workers assembled 3 times a day, sometimes 4 during harvest time, to feast on the bounty of Aunt Paul's kitchen. All in all, it was quite a happy and harmonious place. Farmer Baldur was a good master. He was a tall, serious man, with a long nose and an even longer jaw. Though he seldomly laughed, or even smiled, he was kindly to those who worked for him, and seemed more intent on maintaining them all in health and well-being than extracting the last possible ounce of sweat from them. In many ways, he was more like a father than a master to the 60-odd people who lived on his freeholding. He ate with them, which was unusual, since many farmers in the district sought to hold themselves aloof from their workers, and his presence at the head of the central dining table in the dining hall exerted a restraining influence on some of the younger ones, who tended to sometimes be boisterous. Farmer Falder was a devout man, and he invariably invoked with simple eloquence the blessings of the gods before each meal. The people on his farm, knowing this, filled with some decorum into the dining hall before each meal, and sat in a semblance at least of piety before attacking the heaping platters and bowls of food that Aunt Paul and her helpers had placed before them. Because of Faldor's good heart and the magic of Aunt Paul's deft fingers, the farm was known throughout the district as one of the finest places to live and work for 20 leagues in any direction. Whole evenings were spent in the tavern in the nearby village of Upper Geralt, and minute descriptions of the near miraculous meals served regularly in Falder's dining hall. Less fortunate men who worked at other farms were frequently seen, after several parts of ale, to weep openly at the descriptions at one of Aunt Paul's roasted geese, and the fame of Falder's farm spread throughout the district. The most important man on the farm, aside from Falder, was Durkin, the smith. As Garin grew older and allowed to move out from under Aunt Paul's watchful eye, he found his way inevitably to the smithy. The glowing iron that came from Durkin's forge had an almost hypnotic attraction for him. Durkin was an ordinary-looking man with plain brown hair and a plain face. Ruddy from the heat of his forge, he was neither tall nor short, nor was he thin or stout. He was sober and quiet, and like most men who follow his trade, he was enormously strong. He wore a rough leather jerkin and an apron of the same material. Both were spotted from burns from the sparks which flew from his forge. He always also wore tight-fitting hose and soft leather boots, as was the custom in the parts of Cinderia. At first, Durkin's only words to Garons were warnings to keep his fingers away from the forge and the glowing metal which came from it. In time, however, he and the boy became friends, and he spoke more frequently. "Hello, Suna, and good night, Amp." "Always finish what you have set your hand to," he would advise. "It is bad for the iron if you set it aside and then take it back into the fire more than it is needful." "Why is that?" Garin would ask. Durkin would just shrug. "It just is." "Always do the very best job you can," he said on one other occasion, as he put a last few finishing touches with a file on the metal parts of a wagon tongue he was repairing. "But that piece goes underneath," Garin said. "No one will see it." "But I know it's there," Durkin said, still smoothing the metal. "If it is not done well as I can do it, I'll be ashamed every time I see the wagon go by, and I will see this wagon every day." And so it went. Without even intending to, Durkin instructed the small boy in those solid Siderian virtues of work, thrift, sobriety, good manners, and practicality which formed the backbone of the society. At first, Aunt Paul worried about Garen's attraction to the smithy when it was obvious dangers. But after watching from her kitchen door for a while, she realized that Durkin was almost as watchful of Garen's safety as she was herself, and she became less than concerned. "If the boy becomes pestersome, good man Durkin, send him away," she told the smithy on one occasion when she brought a large copper kettle to the smithy to be patched. "Or tell me, and I'll keep him closer to the kitchen." "He is no bother, Mistress Paul," Durkin said, smiling. "He's a sensible boy and knows when to keep out of the way." "You are too good-natured, friend Durkin," Aunt Paul said. "The boy is full of questions. Answer one and a dozen more pour out." "That is the way of boys," Durkin said, carefully pouring bubbling metal into the small clay ring he had placed around the tiny hole in the bottom of the kettle. "I was questionsome myself when I was a boy. My father and old Barl, the smith who taught me, were patient enough to answer what they could. I'd repay them poorly if I didn't have the same patience with Garon." Garon, who was sitting nearby, had held his breath during this conversation. He knew that one wrong word would on either side would have instantly banished him from the smithy. As Aunt Paul walked back across the yard, the hard-packed dirt of the yard, toward her kitchen with the newly mended kettle, he noticed the way Durkin watched her, and an idea began to form in his mind. It is a simple idea, and the beauty of it was that it provided something for everyone. "Hello! I don't know how to say your name, but welcome into the library." "Aunt Paul," he said that night, wincing as she washed one of his ears with a rough cloth. "Yes," she said, turning his attention to his neck. "Why don't you marry Durkin?" She stopped washing. "What?" "Good night." "I think that would be an awfully good idea." "Oh, do you?" Her voice held Oh, no, you're fine. I'm butchering. No, fine. Honey, it's nothing against you. I'm saying, how do I pronounce your name? If I try to pronounce it, I'm going to butcher it. I'm horrible. Oh, do you? Her voice had a slight edge to it, and Garin knew he was on dangerous grounds. He likes you. Because I'm from Brazil? Well, welcome on in. Do you have a nickname I can call you? Or how do I pronounce your name? Because, like I said, I have dyslexia, so it's horrible. English is bad for me. And I'm English. Sonfit? Sonfit? Da, da, da. Okay. Oh, yeah. Welcome in. No worries. Hope you'll enjoy the story time. Why don't you marry Dernick? She stopped washing. What? She asked. I think that would be an awfully good idea. Oh, do you? Her voice had a slight edge to it, and Garin knew he was on dangerous grounds. He likes you, he said defensively. And I suppose you were discussed this with him? No, he said. I thought I'd talk to you about it first. At least that was a good idea. I can tell him about it in the morning, if you'd like. His head was turned around quite firmly by one ear. Aunt Paul, Garin felt, found his ears far too convenient. Don't you so much as breathe one word of this nonsense to Durkin or anyone else, she said, her dark eyes burning into his with a fire he had never seen there before. It was only a thought, he said quickly. A very bad one. From now on, leave the thinking to grown-ups. She was still holding his ear. Anything you said, say, he agreed hastily. Later that night, however, when they lay in their beds in the quiet darkness, he approached the problem obliquely. Aunt Paul? Yes? Since you don't want to marry Durkin, whom do you want to marry? Garon, she said. Yes? Close your mouth and go to sleep. I think I have a right to know, he said in an injured tone. Garon! All right, I'm going to sleep, but I don't think you're being very fair in all of this. She drew in a deep breath. Very well, she said. I'm not thinking of getting married. I have never thought about getting married, and I seriously doubt that I'll ever think about getting married. I have far too many important things to attend to for any of that. Don't worry, Aunt Paul, he said, wanting to put her mind at ease. When I grow up, I'll marry you. She laughed then, a deep, rich laugh, and reached out to touch his face in the darkness. Oh no, my Garon, she said. There's another wife in store for you. Who? He demanded. You'll find out, she said mysteriously. Now go to sleep. Aunt Paul? Yes? Where's my mother? It was a question he had been meaning to ask for quite some time. There was a long pause, and then Aunt Paul sighed. She died, she said quietly. Garin felt a sudden wrenching surge of grief and unbearable anguish. He began to cry. And then she was beside his bed. She knelt on the floor and put her arms around him. Finally, a long time later, after she had carried him into her own bed and held him close until his grief had run its course, Garin asked brokenly, What was she like? My mother. She was fair-haired, Aunt Paul said, very strong and very beautiful. Her voice was gentle, and she was very happy. Oh, thank you. Did she love me? More than you could imagine. And then he cried again, but his crying was quieter now, more regretful than anguished. Aunt Paul held him closely until he cried himself to sleep. There were other children on Balder's farm, as was only natural in a community of 60 or so. The older ones on the farm all worked, but there were 3 other children about Garen's age on the freeholding. These 3 became his playmates and his friends. The oldest boy was Rundorgi. He was a year or 2 older than Garon and was a bit taller. Ordinarily, since he was the eldest of the children, Rundorgi would have been their leader, but because he was Adrian, his senses were a bit limited, and he cheerfully deferred to the younger ones. The kingdom of Sandaria, unlike other kingdoms, were inhabited by a broad variety of racial stocks. Shirkis, Algarians, Daracinians, Ardrins, and even a substantial number of Toldrins had merged to form the element Sandaria. Adrians, who of course were brave, but also were notoriously thick-twinned. Garen's second playmate was Doran, a small, quick boy whose background was so mixed that he could only be called a Sandarian. The most notable thing about Dorian was the fact that he was always running. He never walked if he could run. Like his feet, his mind seemed to tremble over itself, and his tongue as well. He talked continuously and very fast, and he was always excited. The undisputed leader of the little foursome was the girl Zubretta, a golden-haired charmer who invented their games, made up stories to tell them, and set them on stealing apples and plums from Balder's orchard for her. She ruled them as their little queen, and played one against the other, enticing them into fights. She was quite heartless, and each of the 3 boys at times hated her, even while remaining helplessly thralls to her tiniest whims. In the winter, they sled on wide boards down the snowy hillside behind the farmhouse and returned home wet and snow-covered, with chapped hands and glowing cheeks as evening purple shadows crept across the snow. Or after Dunik the smith had proclaimed the ice safe, they would slide endlessly across the frozen pond that lay glittering frostily in the little dale just east of the farm buildings along the road of the upper Growlet. And if the weather was too cold, or on toward spring when rains and warm winds had the snow slushy and the pond unsafe, they would gather in the hay barn and leap by the hour from the loft into the soft hay beneath, filling their hair with chaff and their noses with dust that smelled of summer. In the spring they caught pollywogs along the marsh edges of the pond and climbed trees to stare in wonder at the tiny blue eggs the birds had laid in twig nests in higher branches. It was Dorian naturally who fell from a tree and broke his arm one fine spring morning when Zabret urged him into the highest branch of the tree near the edge of the pond. Since Rundorg stood helplessly gaping at his injured friend, and Zubret had run away almost before he hit the ground, it fell to Garion to make certain necessary decisions. Gravely, he considered the situation for a few moments, his young face seriously intent beneath his shock of sandy hair. The arm was obviously broken, and Dorian, pale and frightened, bit his lip to keep from crying. A movement caught Garen's eye, and he glanced up quickly. A man in a dark cloak sat astride a large black horse, not far away, watching intently. When their eyes met, Garen felt a momentary chill. He knew that he had seen that man before, that indeed the dark figure had hovered the edge of his vision for as long as he could remember, never speaking, but always watching. There was in that silent scrutiny a kind of cold animosity curiously mingled with something that was almost, but not quite, fear. Then Dorian whimpered, and Garion turned back. Carefully, he bound the injured arm across the front of Dorian's body with his rope belt, and then he and Rundorg helped the injured boy to his feet. At least he could have helped us, Garion said resentfully. Who? Rundorg said, looking around. Garion turned to point at the dark-cloaked man, but the rider was gone. I didn't see anyone, Rundorg said. It hurts, Dorian said. Don't worry, Garion said. Aunt Paul will fix it. And so she did. When the 3 appeared at the door of her kitchen, she took in the situation with a single glance. Bring him over here, she told him. Her voice not even excited, she set the pale and violently trembling boy on a stool near one of the ovens and mixed a tea of several herbs taken from the earth-worn jars on a high shelf in the back of one of her pantries. Drink this, she instructed Dorian, handing him a steaming mug. Will it make my arm well? Dorian asked, suspiciously eyeing the evil-smelling brew. Just drink it, she ordered, laying out some splints and linen straps. Ick, it tastes awful, Dorian said, making a face. It's supposed to, she told him. Drink it all. I don't think I want any more, he said. Very well, she said. She pushed back the splints and took down a long and very sharp knife from a hook on the wall. What are you doing with that? He demanded shakily. Since you don't want to take the medicine, she said blandly, I guess it'll have to come off. Off? Dorian squeaked, his eyes bulging. Probably right about there, she said thoughtfully, touching his arm at the elbow with the point of the knife. Tears coming into his eyes, Dorian gulped down the rest of the liquid, and a few minutes later he was nodding, almost drowsing on his stool. He screamed once, though, when Aunt Paul set the broken bone, but after the arm had been ramped and splinted, he drowsed again. Aunt Paul spoke briefly with the boy's frightened mother, and then had Durkin carry him up to bed. You wouldn't really cut off his arm, Garen said. Aunt Paul looked at him, her expression unchanging. Oh? She said, and he was no longer sure. I think I'll have a word with Mistress Zubrette now, she said then. She ran away when Dorian fell out of the tree, Garen said. Find her. She's hiding, Garen protested. She always hides when something goes wrong. I wouldn't even know where to look for her. Garen, Aunt Paula said, I didn't ask you if you knew where to look. I told you to find her and bring her to me. What if she won't come? Garion hedged. Garion! There was a note of awful finality in Aunt Paul's tone, and Garion fled. I didn't have anything to do with it, Zubrette lied as soon as Garion led her to Aunt Paula in the kitchen. You, Aunt Paul said, pointing to the stool. Sit! Zubrette sat onto the stool, her mouth open and her eyes wide. You, Aunt Paul said to Garion, pointing to the kitchen door. Out! Garion left hurriedly. 10 minutes later, a sobbing little girl stumbled out of the kitchen. Aunt Paul stood in the doorway, looking after her with eyes as hard as ice. Did you thrash her? Garion said hopefully. Aunt Paul withered him with a glance. Of course not, she said. You don't thrash girls. I would have, Garion said, disappointed. What did you do to her? Don't you have anything to do? Aunt Paul asked. No, Garion said. Not really. That, of course, was a mistake. Good, Aunt Paul said, finding one of his ears. It's time you started to earn your way. You'll find some dirty parts in the scullery. I'd like to have them scrubbed. I don't know why you're angry with me, Garion objected, squirming. It's not my fault that Dorian went up in that tree. The scullery, Garion, she said. Now. The rest of spring and the early part of the summer were quiet. Dorian, of course, could not play until his arm mended, and Zubrette had been so shaken by whatever that was that Aunt Paul had said to her that she avoided the other two boys. Garion was only left with only Rundorg to play with, and Rundorg was not bright enough to be much fun. Because there was nothing really else to do, the boys often went into the fields to watch the handworks and listen to their talk. As it happened during the particular summer, the men on Falder's farm were talking about the Battle of Vomibri, the almost cataclysm event in the history of the West. Garion and Rudberg listened, enthralled as the men unfolded the story of how the hordes of Kaltork were suddenly struck into the West some 500 years before. It all began in 4865, as the men reckoned time in that part of the world, when vast multitudes of Morgors and Nardaks and Thulls had struck down across the mountains into the eastern encampments of Drasnina, and behind them in endless waves had come the uncountable numbers of the Malroians. After Denistra had been brutally crushed, the Argonauts had turned southward onto the vast grasslands of Algeria and had laid siege to the enormous fortress called the Algerian Stronghold. The siege had lasted for 8 years until finally, in disgust, Kaltork had abandoned it. It was not until he turned his army westward into Ogorland that the other kingdoms became aware that the Agnok invasion was directed not only against the Alnorns, but against all of the West. In the summer of 4875, Kaltork had come down upon the Adrianish plan before the city of Vormibri, and it was there that with the combined armies of the West awaited him. The Sindarians who participated in the battle were part of the force under the leadership of Brand, the Bavarian warder. The forces consisted of Bavarians, Sindarians, and Austrian Aryans, assaulted the Agnok rear after the left had been engaged by Algaras, Drenasians, and Ulgars, the right by the Thordarians and Chiriks, in the front by the legendary charge of the Mabit Edarians. For hours the battle had raged until in the center of the field Brand had met in a single combat with Kaltork himself. Upon the duel had hinged the outcome of the battle. Although 20 generations had passed since the titanic encounter, it was still fresh in the memory of the Sindarian farmers who worked on Valder's farm, as it had only happened yesterday. Each blow was described, and each feint in par. At the final moment, when it seemed that he must inevitably be overthrown, Brand had removed the covering from his shield, and Kaltork, taken back by some momentary confusion, had lowered his guard and been instantly struck down. For Ragnar, the description of the battle was enough to set his Andrish blood seething. Garen, however, found that certain questions had been left unanswered by the stories. Why was Brand's shield's cover? He asked Kaltor, one of the hands. Kaltor shrugged. It just was, he said. Everyone I've ever talked to about it with it agrees on it. Was it a magic shield? Garen persisted. It must have been, Kaltor said. But I've never heard of anyone say so. All I know is that when Brand uncovered his shield, Kaltork dropped his own shield, and Brand stabbed his sword into Kaltork's head through the eye. Or so I'm told. Garen shook his head stubbornly. I don't understand, he said. How would something like that make Kaltork afraid? I can't say, Kaltor told him. I never heard anyone else explain it. Despite his dissatisfaction of the story, Garen quickly agreed to Ragnar's rather simple plan to reenact the duel. After a day or so of posturing and banging at each other with sticks to simulate swords, Garen decided that they needed some equipment to make the game more enjoyable. 2 kettles and 2 pot lids mysteriously disappeared from Aunt Paul's kitchen, and Garen and Rundorg, now with helmets and shields, repaired to a quiet place to do war upon each other. It was all going quite splendidly until Ragnar, who was taller and stronger, struck Garen a resounding whack on the head with his wooden sword. The rim of the kettle cut into Garen's eyebrow, and the blood began to flow. There was a sudden ring in Garen's ears, and a kind of boiling exultation surged up in his veins as he rose to his feet from the ground. He never knew afterward quite what happened. He had only sketchy memories of shouting defiance at Kaltork in words which sprang to his lips, and which even he didn't understand. Randor's familiar and somewhat foolish face was no longer the face before him, but rather was misplaced by something hideously maimed and ugly. In a fury, Garen struck at that face again and again with the fire seething in his brain. And when it was over, poor Ragnar lay at his feet, beaten senselessly by the enraged attack. Garen was horrified at what he had done, but at the same time there was a fiery taste of victory in his mouth. Later in the kitchen, where all injuries on the farm were routinely taken, Aunt Paul tended to their wounds with only minimal comments about them. Rundorg didn't seem to be seriously hurt, though his face had begun to swell and turn purple in several places. He had difficulty focusing his eyes at first. A few cold cloths on his head and one of Aunt Paul's potions quickly restored him. The cut on Garion's brow, however, required a bit more attention. She had Dernick hold the boy down when she took out the needle and thread and sewed up the cut as calmly as she would have repaired a rip in his sleeve, all the while ignoring the howls from her patient. All in all, she seemed much more concerned about the dented kettles and battered pot lids than about the war wounds of the two boys. When it was over, Garion had a headache and was taken up to bed. At least I beat Kaltorek, he told Aunt Paul somewhat drowsily. She looked at him sharply. Where did you hear about Torek? She demanded. It's Kaltorek, Aunt Paul. Garen explained patiently. Answer me. The farmers were telling stories. All Kaltor had and the others about Bran and Vomibrai and Kaltork and all the rest. That's why Rudrak and I were playing. I was Bran and he was Kaltork. I didn't get to uncover my shield, though. Ragnar hit me on the head before we got that far. I want you to listen to me, Garin, Aunt Paul said, and I want you to listen to me carefully. You are to never speak the name of Tork again. It's Kaltork, Aunt Paul, Garin explained, not just Tork. Then she hit him, which she had never done before. The slap across his mouth surprised him more than it hurt, for she did not hit him hard. You will never speak of the name Tork again. Never, she said. This is important, Garion. Your safety depends on it. I want your promise. You don't have to be so angry about it, he said, in an injured tone. Promise. All right, I promise. It was only a game. A very foolish one, Aunt Paul said. You might have killed Rundurg. What about me? Garion protested. You were never in danger, she told him. Now go to sleep. As he dozed fitfully, his head light from his injury, and the strange bitter drink his aunt had given him, he seemed to hear her deep reach voice, saying, Garion, my Garion, you're too young yet, and later rising from a deep sleep, as fishes rise toward the silvery surface of the water, he seemed to hear her call, Father, I need you. Then he plunged into a troubled sleep, haunted by a dark figure of a man on a black horse, who watched his every movement with cold animosity, and sometimes hovered very near the edge of fear. And behind that figure he always known there to be, but had never outwardly acknowledged even to Aunt Paul, the maimed and ugly face he had briefly seen or imagined in the fight with Rundorg, loomed darkly, like the hideous fruit of an unspeakable evil tree. Hello, my dear apprentices. Remember to like and subscribe, and also feel free to explore the library some more. I don't know what you'll find, but I'm sure it'll be fun.